Hey everyone, welcome to yet another episode of the Inner Roland podcast. Gotta say, I'm in a really good mood today because I just sat for the AWS Developer Associate examination and passed it. So I'm feeling good. It's always a good feeling to work towards something and then kind of achieve it. And well, I guess now what? Back to the meaninglessness of life. In any case, this is going to be an interesting episode because the previous episode I did a few weeks ago was my first ever book review. And I think this is going to be the first ever article, or let's say essay commentary. And it's going to be on the piece that David Gagnon, I really hope I pronounce your surname right, David. Apologies, I mean, no disrespect. It's going to be on the polemical piece that David wrote on Jordan Peterson. And frankly, from everything I've read on Jordan Peterson, you know, I think to date this is the best criticism I've read of him in a very deep sense, not in like a superficial, I don't know, the kind of what like corporate media does, sort of dismissive, calling him a fringe, far right, whatever. But I really thought David's criticism was very apt to the our current situation, but also just philosophically, it was quite deep, and he made a lot of sense. And he's a great writer. I only hope to write like David one day. Now, I've got to say, of course, as I said, this piece is a polemic, and unlike myself, David is very, very critical of Peterson and doesn't like him at all. Now I personally do like Jordan Peterson quite a lot. I've been influenced by him, especially I'd say when I was about 20, 21. This is like around 2016. I started watching his lectures early on, and I really enjoyed his lectures. I still very much enjoy the lectures he did on the psychologist. Like, for example, I think my best learning on John Piaget was through Jordan Peterson. I'd even say Jordan Peterson was the person who introduced me to Heidegger a couple of years ago. Even though Peterson doesn't really go into Heidegger's philosophy, kind of he lectures on him through like a psychological lens. In any case, the point I'm trying to make is that I really like Jordan Peterson, and that's exactly the reason I think it's important for me to make this episode and record this, and I'll get into more as to why that is later on. So, firstly, I want to put a quick caveat, as I tend to do with these episodes. I will truly try and keep away from the day to day politics or contemporary issues Peterson gets himself involved in. He tends to do that from time to time. I think he kind of likes it. Let's be honest. He likes the attention. I mean, I love the doc, but he loves the attention he gets. But rather, in David's paper, I'm going to focus on the philosophical critiques. Oh, I didn't mention this. The how I came across this was actually through David's YouTube channel, Theory and Philosophy, which I'd say now at this point in my life is my greatest source of learning when it comes to philosophy and theory, especially being a software engineer, having no background in arts or the humanities. I studied computer science. I didn't even know how to study or learn about all these different theories and philosophies because I never had any proper formal academic training. Even though I deeply love the humanities, I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me. I spent so much of my time trying to understand it and, read philosophy and literature and all of that. Um, so I'd say at this point in my life, without a question, man, David's YouTube channel is my one of my greatest sources of learning. It's a great resource, really, to go through virtually any book. I'll go through some of the stuff he did later on. Recently, I went through his Kant, Critique of Pure Reason series. My favorite Banan was the one he did on Hannah Arendt. My God, such a good series, David. Really, mate. You just have an amazing ability. You're so eloquent, and it- also I like that you speak with no pretension, which I appreciate as a layperson, or as a neophyte. Sorry, I'm kind of all over the place, but in the preamble, I want to state, as I said, I'll try to stick to more of the philosophical critiques, more of the ideological critiques, and not get too unraveled in the kind of day to day fleeting politics, let's say. And of course, as I said, I'm a big fan of Peterson. I also like some of the figures in the intellectual dark web, and that begs the question: why should we be skeptical and question these public intellectuals, people like Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, Brett Weinstein, Harvey Weinstein? No, God, Harvey Weinstein. That's funny. What's Brett's brother's name? Eric Weinstein. We should definitely question Harvey Weinstein. Ah, right. That was. I swear that wasn't intentional. That was just a mistake. In any case, all these people in the intellectual dark web, why we should question them. And I think the reason is because, firstly, whenever I feel that the narratives that people give out to the world, or the philosophies people uh, propagate and advocate for, let's say, when they're too coherent, when they're too, let's say, when they're too much of like a salvation, when they're too redemptive, or when they're too, this is it. We've got the absolute philosophy, we've got the absolute ideology to make something work. I generally take a step back and I become a bit skeptical. Because for me, in many ways, I'm an absurdist. So there really isn't the kind of coherence that a lot of the people in the intellectual dark web would like to portray. And it's actually a point David gets to in his article, which is what I really liked. So I think whenever we feel like we're getting easy answers, easy solutions, or not even easy really, but the kind of solutions that seem straightforward without any deeper introspection and deeper inspection into it. I think we should be skeptical of those kind of solutions. And I would say, speaking personally, uh, around around 2 or 3 years ago, when I really started to like Jordan Peterson, I realized that I was liking him a bit too much, almost to the level of obsequiousness. And that was definitely unhealthy, because I realized, wow, I can't even read a honest criticism of his work without taking it personally, as if he's some of my personal savior or whatever. And that's when I truly wanted to only again treat Jordan Peterson as a person who influences me, but not as the only point of influence, or like this kind of he's in Christ, to put it in a dramatic way. Um, and that's when I started questioning him a little bit more and looking for points of view that differ from him, points of view that he's completely averse to, let's say. And I realized, oh wow, I actually completely disagree, or predominantly with most of his points. I disagree with his politics and even his underlying philosophy. Despite, and here's the interesting thing, despite truly starting to admire and like him as a person, as an individual, as a teacher, and as a psychologist, like I still find his work on psychology to be brilliant. I think he's a great psychologist, even though I think he's got his politics and his philosophy uh, quite wrong, and I see a lot of loopholes with his worldview. And as a person, I've got to say again, one never knows, especially with public figures, how they portray themselves in public. That kind of distinction between the private life and the between the personal life and the public life. Peterson looks like a genuine person to me. He looks sincere, and I'm, speaking purely personally, I'm the kind of person that appreciates family and having a good relationship with your significant other, your wife, your spouse, whatever, your children. And I find that he's got that kind of relationship, and it seems just that true love of a family. And I appreciate anyone who can foster that and who can have that in life, because that certainly takes work. So, yeah, those are the points of the preamble. And that, of course, leads me to this point. And I wasn't even going to put this part in the episode, but I realized that actually maybe it's something I should talk about before I get to the article itself. Um, I still don't know if David steelman or strawman Peterson's arguments. I don't know if he mischaracterized him and whether how he portrayed Peterson's oppositions to Bill C-16. Um, Got to keep in mind, David too is a philosophy student. I think he's doing a PhD in philosophy. Anyway, he's an art student. So, he, you know, I don't want to make an argument from authority, but I do think someone who's taken the time to go and study theory and go and study philosophy uh, in academia, I still hold academia in high regard, contrary to most people on the internet. And I would say a person like that probably has a better understanding of some of the intricacies of these debates when it comes to free speech, pronouns, or all the different fragments that are connected in the whole Bill 16 controversy. So I didn't get the impression that David was trying to mischaracterize Peterson, but also that's the one a reason for that is because sometimes Peterson himself isn't coherent with what his arguments are in his opposition to Bill C-16. He will say it's a purely free speech issue, but then you can see from some of the interviews, which is the interview that I'm going to play right now, that it's it's not just a free speech issue. He's got an issue with the gender identification too. So, without me, putting words in his mouth, let's listen to this short clip that I found on Majid Nawaz's show, where I mean this was in 2018, so a bit after the whole controversy broke out, and I think this is the shortest clip I could find where Peterson lays down his points, kind of enumerates all his points as to why he opposes Bill C-16. So let's take a look.
Bill C-16 purported to do nothing but extend human rights provisions to an excluded group, let's say, to the transgender and non-gender binary types, and that was the federal legislation. It also made it a hate crime to discriminate or harass, essentially. So now then the question is, well, what exactly do you mean by discriminate or harass? And why exactly is that a hate crime under the criminal code? Well, there was an answer to that. The answer was, well, this bill will be interpreted in light of the policies generated by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, very large set of policies. Now, the Ontario Human Rights Commission is a radically leftist organization. I think it's the most dangerous organization in Canada, although you could debate that.
Of course, I've got to make a comment. So I'm going to make comments in the middle of what he's saying. I mean, if you want to watch the whole thing without me interrupting, just go and watch the original video. But you see, this is another thing about Peterson. As much as I like him, when he makes a statement, such a blatant statement that the Ontario Human Rights Commission is the most dangerous organization in all of Canada, that's where, touching on my earlier point, one should take a step back and, is it really? Like, what does he mean by that? The most dangerous that's quite a leap to call an organization the most dangerous organization in all of Canada. This is where I think we should pause the video, because it's normally on YouTube that he's popular, and actually think and not let him, when I mean him, I mean Peterson, or anyone for that matter, do the thinking for us. So back to the video.
Debate that. And they said all sorts of policies about how this legislation was going to be interpreted, and the federal government linked to their website to state that Bill C-16 would be interpreted in light of those guidelines. So I went and read all the policies. Well, one of the policies was that if you didn't use the preferred pronouns of a given group, that you could be charged essentially with a hate crime. And I thought, no,
which given group is that? You're talking about transgender people.
Yeah, and so there's all these pronouns that have come up. There's 70 different sets of pronouns approximately to hypothetically describe people who don't fit anywhere on the gender spectrum, which is also something that I don't really understand. I don't understand that conceptually.
We'll come to that, but I just want to hear the story of this bill first.
Okay, so now a person is compelled under Canadian law to use the pronoun of another individual's choice on pain of law. And I thought, well, no, that's not acceptable. It's one thing to put limits on what a person can't say, like say with hate speech laws, which I also don't agree with, by the way, but that's a different argument. I think it's a narrower argument. But to compel me to use a certain content when I'm formulating my thoughts or my actions under threat of legislative action, I thought, no, what's happened there is the government has introduced compelled speech legislation into the private sphere. It's never happened in the history of English common law. And so I said, there's no way I'm abiding by that. I don't care what your damn rationale is. We're compassionate. It's like, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're playing this radical collectivist left-wing game. You're trying to gain linguistic supremacy in the area of public discourse. You're doing that using compassion as a guise, and you're pulling the wool over people's eyes. And you're not going to do it with me.
If I was sitting here in front of you as a transgendered male to female or female to male, and we began the conversation, at the beginning of the conversation, you stumbled and called me he or she, and I was perhaps identifying the other way around. And then if I'd said to you, please, I'd rather go by she. How would you respond to that on a personal level? How would you?
Well, it would depend on the situation, but the way I have responded to that, because I've had a number of conversations with transgendered individuals, is that I use whatever pronoun seems to go along with the persona that they're projecting publicly. It's the simplest thing to do. Now, if we were,
you would respect their choice on an individual level.
Yeah. But with a more contentious pronouns, je and je, and that sort of thing, that's a whole different issue. Because the question there is, well, exactly what is it that you're doing when you're asking me to use those words? Like, are you compelling me to play your particular ideological game, or is this actually a matter of some personal identity that's important to you? And those things are not obvious. And so in a situation like that, the first thing I'd have to do is to try to figure out just exactly what was going on in the situation, and that's not simple. And so there would be no foregone conclusion that I would address you by the pronouns of your choice. And the first thing I'd want to find out is that just a narcissistic power play? Because that's actually the most likely outcome.
I don't know if that's the most likely outcome. And, Peterson does make a good point. Like, again, there are manipulative, almost psychopathic narcissists in this world who want to manipulate people and play power games. So that certainly is the case. But again, so I've got a few points to make on what Peterson just said. On what Majid Nawaz said about on a personal level, that's an important word he used, personal. I think a lot of this comes down to that. It comes down to those interpersonal relations and how we treat each other. We can't bureaucratize it, even though I feel like modern society is trying to, in many ways, everything is abstracted out into the ether, into the bureaucracy. Into like the Kafkaesque bureaucracy, and then even things that are so intimate and so personal, modernity is bureaucratizing it. And it's kind of unfortunate because a lot of this, which should be dealt at an individual level, is trying to be dealt with laws and policies, which frankly I don't think works. Firstly, it's not authentic, and secondly, just practically, I think it fails. And then on the point Peterson makes about what kind of game you're playing, so you can clearly see that for him, it's not just a free speech issue. The gender issue does play a factor, and he also is particularly averse to people who are, let's say, gender fluid or people who are non-binary. You can see that it doesn't click for him. He can't comprehend what that means, and fair enough. I mean, to a certain extent, I never really had a problem with the whole gender fluid thing. I always felt deep down in a very visceral sense that, yeah, gender certainly doesn't seem something that's binary. It doesn't seem like something that's fixed. In fact, I don't think human nature is fixed. I think human nature is way more dynamic than we think. It's a lot more deeper than what, in modernity, the post-enlightenment era, where we would like to put everything in comfortable boxes. Human nature is a lot more deeper than that, in my opinion. And David kind of touches on that in his article too. But also his thing about, this is where again, I don't know whether Peterson does a good job in how he articulates his points, because it seems a bit vitriolic, or it seems a bit hateful the way he talks about non-binary people. Again, these are just, I'm just touching on my intuitions. I'm not saying this is exactly what he's saying. Not at all. When he says, are non-binary people playing some kind of narcissistic power play, or they're trying to manipulate other people? Personally, from my experience, I've only really got one non-binary friend, because all of my other friends are transgender, which means all the other friends in the LGBTQ community, which means they still identify just by the opposite gender, not the one that was assigned at birth. And that's fine. And some of them, one of them actually, I don't even know until she told me. In any case, the non-binary people, yeah, it is a bit odd. I'm gonna be totally honest, referring to someone as they. But this person that I do know, in no way did I get the impression that this person was playing some kind of game, or this person was trying to manipulate me into, as Peterson says, trying to control my linguistic territory. I didn't get that impression at all. And if I did, I wouldn't be that person's friend. I wouldn't associate that person. Simple as that. And I think the person genuinely didn't feel like a man or a woman, or felt non-binary, whatever that means. I don't know what that means, because I don't feel like that. And that's something we gotta learn about about life itself, that in some sense, this is apocryphally attributed to Kierkegaard, but when you label me, you negate me. I think it comes from this Kierkegaard's idea that in many ways that deep innerness, that subjectivity of being human, it can never be quantified. It can never be properly betrayed or abstracted out from the individual. No one will ever know what it feels like to be me, nor will I ever know what it feels like to be some other specific individual. Not an abstract humanity. No, a specific individual. And that's, for me, my thinking has been heavily influenced by Kierkegaard in that way. And, funny enough, Peterson too, talks a lot about Kierkegaard. So, saying all that, with that long preamble, good Lord, it's 20 minutes already, and I haven't even got to David's article yet. Let's discuss David's piece. The article's titled, Jordan Peterson and the Flow of Scientific Inquiry. A critical evaluation of Peterson's use of science and philosophy in his conquest against social justice, by David Gagnon. Again, I'm so sorry if I got your surname wrong, David. I truly mean no disrespect. So the article starts off by two quotes by Baudrillard and Nietzsche. And I also want to say, I only knew of Baudrillard as his name in the French intellectual circles. It's because of David that I've actually truly kind of delved into his work a bit more and started to understand him. So again, as I said, David's YouTube channel has had what can't I speak? David's YouTube channel has had a massive influence on me in the past year or so. I'm truly grateful for that, David. In any case, back to the article. If all enigmas are resolved, the stars go out. If everything secret is returned to the visible, if all illusion is returned to transparence, then heaven become indifferent to the earth. Jean Baudrillard. What is the purpose? And worse still, what is the origin of all science? What? Is scientific method perhaps no more than fear of and flight from pessimism, a subtle defense against truth? Or, to put it in moral terms, is it something like cowardice and insincerity? To put it immorally, is it a form of cunning? O Socrates, Socrates, was that perhaps your secret? O mysterious ironist, was this perhaps your irony? Friedrich Nietzsche. David starts off the article saying, this article argues that Peterson's challenge to postmodern thought as an anti-scientific doctrine is perplexing, given the general lack of consensus between his views and those of the greater scientific community. The article presents different theoretical frameworks attesting to the reality of gender non-conforming identities as well as to the consequences of denying these identities, and argues that rather than challenging oppressive systems of governance, Peterson's project actually mirrors them. So, pretty much, the article breaks down JB's project into three broad conceptual domains. The three of them are the first one's arguments about postmodernism. So, Peterson's averseness against postmodernism and how he portrays postmodernism. And of course, the most interesting part, in my opinion, that I learned a lot from this part, really, the part where David touches on the scientific discourse, truth, and objectivity. Brilliant section of the article. And the other part is the more of the political part, let's say, on gender identity. Now, I'll focus on the latter. I'll focus on the former. The arguments about postmodernism and the scientific discourse, truth, and objectivity parts over the latter, which is the gender identity part, simply because for me, I don't know if I'm speaking from a position of privilege here, but I didn't really care too much about the whole gender identity issue because it didn't really personally affect me. And even in this article, that was the part that I did read it a couple of times for this video, but just skimmed over it. It didn't really speak to me in a deeper sense. But certainly, the points David make are quite interesting, especially when he speaks of Judith Butler and Baudrillard. I'm going to get to that part a bit later, but I do recommend reading the whole thing, of course, because, unlike a book, this is an article, so you could just read it in one sitting. David states, this article presents counter-arguments and evidence that destabilize the facile deployment of a scientific rationality by Peterson and his allies, and therefore calls into question many of his central claims. This paper moves through each of these domains methodically, beginning with his juxtaposition of postmodernism with neo-Marxism, all the while claiming to be a faithful reader to Friedrich Nietzsche. That point there, all the while claiming to be a faithful reader to Friedrich Nietzsche, is an important one because maybe I'll get to that later on in detail, but if someone listens to Peterson's lectures and then gets this impression of who Nietzsche is and then actually reads Nietzsche, in my opinion at least, it's a completely different, the contradistinction is very evident because the actual Nietzsche is very much different to the kind of Nietzsche Peterson portrays, in my opinion. So that's an important one, and I thought that was a good point David raised in this article. This is something I started feeling about 2 years ago when I actually started reading Nietzsche's work, especially The Gay Science and Beyond Good and Evil. So anyway, that's an interesting thing to think about. Of course, I also found there's a problem with Peterson sort of prima facie associating postmodernism with totalitarianism. And I think David again brings this point to salience too. And furthermore, the kind of the incommensurability between neo-Marxism, which is a meta-narrative, and postmodernism. David asks, is it true that postmodernism is merely a clever Marxist sleight of hand, seeking, like its Marxist predecessor, to undermine the West? Well, again, if you listen to Peterson, that's the impression you get. But if you do a bit more excavating into, let's say, the oeuvre of postmodern philosophy and literature, which is virtually an impossible task because there's so much, you might get a different impression. But even if you read let's say the well-known postmodernists, or the kind of the postmodernists Peterson talks about, like Derrida and Foucault, you'd find that, actually no, it's not easy to just pinpoint them as Marxists. I mean, Foucault was an anarchist, for God's sake. And then this is a good point. I've spoken about this before in my previous episodes, and David certainly puts it in a much more articulate and eloquent manner than I've ever done. Scientific rationality is fragile, and we can't unequivocally place faith on the science. I'm putting it in quotes because the science is a very it's a term with a lot of baggage. The science. We can't put this kind of faith of science being universal, ahistorical, acultural, and most certainly when we take the scientific institution, we can't derive social values from it. And that's a good point David makes using Baudrillard. And I was thinking about this recently. The intellectual dark web, Peterson, all these, I mean, I know the intellectual dark web doesn't really exist anymore, but people, from that ilk would agree with this statement, I think, especially with what happened with COVID, because most of them were involved with all these controversies regarding the lockdowns, as in the midst of COVID, the lockdowns, the vaccinations, and they would agree that science isn't this entity, let's say, that you could just detach, or science isn't this thing that can just plainly be detached from the rest of society, and from our, let's say, our perspectives. I don't know if anything really, being a human being, this is again Nietzsche's perspectivism. Being a human being, I don't know if you can really detach anything from a perspective. So from the context, from a social context, and this again is something I've truly begun to appreciate about the postmodernists. That kind of skepticism, even though I understand that can easily become cynicism, and that certainly isn't what I'm trying to do here. Even though maybe sometimes in this article David just become a bit cynical, but that's fine. We all can become. Life is tough. Being cynical sometimes is warranted. So the section that we're going to get to right now is the inconsiderability of Marxism and postmodernism. The point David makes is simply it's wrong to claim postmodernists are Marxists in disguise. It's too simplistic and it's a lazy argument. And David points it out in this article. Claire Hemmings problematizes this approach to postmodernism and Marxism by emphasizing some of the most significant differences between the two theoretical frameworks. She writes that postmodernism's attention to complexity of meaning and interpretation distracted us from the most substantive concerns with inequality, experience, political economy, and justice that Marxism attends to. Hemmings extends this analysis by suggesting that without a Marxist or other tangible approach to critical theory, we remain powerless to alter the pernicious power relations our post-structuralist tactics can cleverly identify, but spectacularly fail to transform. Hemings's point stresses the lack of consistency between Marxist and post-structuralist theories, demonstrating that their fundamental incongruency in the domain of political action, with the former emphasizing a radical transformation of capitalism into a socialist system, and the latter belonging to the domain of theory interested in the immaterial conditions of signification. What I got from this para really was, in a very colloquial sense, let's say, Marxism is predominantly a call to political and social action. That's what the Communist Manifesto is pretty much is, even though I'm not reducing Marxism just to the Communist Manifesto, certainly not. But it seems clear to me, at least, as a layperson, a neophyte, that Marxism is clearly a call to action. Anyone who, in my opinion, is a Marxist is sort of is concomitantly an activist. There's no, in my opinion, they just come together. They're coupled, let's say. Whereas postmodernism and post-structuralism is very much a theory. It's against what Claire Hemmings writes about, identifies here of it being, the importance of context, the depths and layers of meaning, all of that. So it's breaking down language. So it is different. One can't just, again, as I said, prima facie attribute a postmodernist to also be a Marxist, or put it in a Petersonian way, to say that postmodernism is a sleight of hand for Marxism. And then David writes on Jean Baudrillard. Jean Baudrillard referred to by some as the high priest of postmodernism, is one such figure that greatly disturbs Peterson's conflation of Marxist and postmodern theories. In The Mirror of Production, Baudrillard vehemently challenges Marxism, asking, are we quite simply within a mode of production at all? And have we ever been in one? Baudrillard extends this question by turning his critical gaze back on Marxism, suggesting that Marxism is predicated on the fundamentally, this is an important point, on the fundamentally Eurocentric tenets of productivism, scientism, and historicism, and that it homogenizes earlier societies under the light of the present structure of the capitalist economy, therefore silencing specific socio-historical contexts, projecting onto them the spectral light of political economy. Oh, that was a bit dense. This book marked a fundamental turning point in Baudrillard's work as he grew wary of the possibility that Marxism could actually provide the blueprints for an effective mode of societal change. I would say as much of an anti-capitalist that I've become, and especially in the past, let's say, year or so, I've truly seen a lot of loopholes and a lot of problems with modernity and capitalism. The reason I'm still not a Marxist, or I probably will never be one, is because of this point David makes, but more importantly Baudrillard makes, that they're too materialistic. For me, Marxism is too contemporary in that sense. It's too ephemeral. It doesn't look into the deeper realities of society and being human. And again, it's too it's too, let's say, I mean, there's even a term called scientific, is it called scientific socialism or scientific utopianism? It's a lot of, it's heavily influenced by this post-enlightenment kind of thought, and it tends to ignore so much, and when I mean it, I should say this is both capitalism and Marxism, tends to ignore human psychology, culture, sociology. Therefore, Baudrillard makes a brilliant, perspicacious point here that shouldn't we be a bit critical of these prescriptions we are making on to society, and we're saying that this will work. And then David makes a comment on Foucault. In the order of things, he systematically, Michel Foucault, in the order of things, he systematically avoids discussing Marxism in terms of economic theory in favor of many other liberal approaches to economics indicative of the work of Adam Smith and Francois Quesnay. Foucault does this because, as he makes abundantly clear, he believes that Marxism exists in 19th century thought like a fish in water, that is, it is unable to breathe anywhere else. Foucault made the point that I was trying to make before in a much better way. This is exactly what I was trying to say. This sentiment resonates in harmony with the overarching themes of his work because he refuses to acknowledge that societal ills or power can be reduced to a single structural locus. When I read this point, for a moment I thought this was Peterson writing, because Peterson has made strikingly similar points to that which Foucault makes, especially when he speaks of ideology, that the fragment can't replace the whole, that ideology only sees part of the picture. So in that sense, Peterson would 100% agree with Foucault here. Well, not 100% because, nothing works in absolutes, but the point I'm trying to make is that, good heavens, Peterson certainly has made very similar points. And back to what David's saying, thus Foucault is highly skeptical of the possibility of a meaningful societal revolution because without a comprehensive evaluation of the plethora of institutions that govern our daily lives, we risk perpetuating the same oppressive schema. And here David makes a really interesting point. He says, the thinkers that Peterson cites as representatives of postmodern movement, Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, were greatly indebted to the Western philosophical and literary canons, with some commentators even labeling them neo-Kantians. Peterson's reduction of these thinkers to philosophical aberrations detached from Western civilization illuminates his obliviousness to said canon. Great point by David here, a very important one in this article, because this conversation Peterson had with Camille Paglia perfectly illustrates what David's saying here, because you can clearly see both of them, Paglia and Peterson, are being like very dismissive of these French intellectuals, saying that they didn't read the classics, that they weren't well read in the Western canon, they were uneducated. But good heavens, I mean, maybe this is just my own ignorance and my lack of, let's say, proper academic training. But when I read some of, I've only mostly read Sartre and Foucault, I don't get the impression at all that they're uneducated or that they haven't read enough Western philosophy, because they seem deeply well-read scholars, and I don't think in any way one could say that they're aberrations to Western philosophy. In many ways, as David points out, they seem to be continuing on. I'm not saying it's just them, but they seem to be continuing on the Kantian project. All the way from Kant to Heidegger to whatever is going to come up now. And I don't think the aberrations in that case. And this conversation Peterson had with Paglia does demonstrate. I wouldn't say, look, I think the point David makes here eliminates his own obliviousness to said canon. That might be a bit unfair, but it does demonstrate that deep, visceral hatred Peterson has for these French intellectuals by being sort of casually dismissive of them. And then we get to another very important point, and especially a point that I really enjoyed, a part of the essay that I really enjoyed, especially given my recent, let's call it, enamorment with Hannah Arendt's work. It's the section Peterson, Arendt, and Totalitarianism. Peterson doesn't seem to mention Hannah Arendt much in his work. Yes, he does speak a lot about totalitarianism for sure. I mean, Maps of Meaning was pretty much all about Peterson trying to understand, not the Nazis and totalitarianism and tyranny and all of that. But rarely does he mention Hannah Arendt, which is quite surprising, as David points out. He says, what is particularly striking is that Peterson makes no significant use of Hannah Arendt, the thinker of fascism and totalitarianism par excellence. I agree. He does mention her briefly, however, suggesting that her seminal text, The Banality of Evil, would have better been more appropriately titled The Evil of Banality. In fact, let me find that quote so that, we don't want to give the impression that David's quoting Peterson out of context here. It's 369. I could quickly find the quote because I was going through this a few days ago. Peterson writes, nonetheless, we are more than we seem and are more trouble than we imagine when undisciplined and unrealized. The banality of evil, Hannah Arendt's famous phrase, applied to the often unprepossessing Nazi personality, is more accurately the evil of banality. Our petty weaknesses accumulate and multiply and become the great evils of state. As our technological power expands, the danger we pose increases and the consequences of our voluntary stupidity multiply. It is increasingly necessary that we set ourselves, not others, right, and that we learn explicitly what that means. Yes, so again, this is Peterson from 1999, and he still very much talks and writes in similar prose and similar themes. So again, the point I'm trying to make is David hasn't misquoted him in any way or quoted him out of context. The absence of Arendt's work in Peterson's exploration of these themes is suspicious and signals that his understanding of totalitarianism is missing integral philosophical insight. Perhaps true. This is particularly true of the lineage he traces between nihilism and the development of totalitarianism. So another bit of an experiment I did was I went on incognito. I had to, and I Googled just plainly Jordan Peterson and Hannah Arendt. And I wanted to see if there was anything that involved Peterson talking about Hannah Arendt, and I couldn't find anything, not in his writing, not in his lectures. So David is right here. In fact, the only thing I found was this Reddit thread of another person asking on the Jordan Peterson subreddit, is anyone here familiar with Hannah Arendt? Because both Peterson and Hannah Arendt seem to be, in the deepest possible way, trying to understand totalitarianism. Maybe Peterson more from a psychological perspective and Hannah Arendt more from a sociological and philosophical perspective, but I would certainly imagine Peterson bring her up in more of his lectures. So that is a point to keep in mind. And just a completely ancillary point here, I think what really turned me to Hannah Arendt's work again was David for sure, but in particular it was this series David did, Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. In fact, I ordered the book and it's on its way. I thought Amazon Prime was much faster, but they're taking like weeks to deliver the book. Doesn't matter. But I wanna this is gonna be the next book that I read. It's on my list because this series David did, it was amazing. I learned so much, and I had to read the book. There was no question about it because David converted me into a erudite. Anyway, and this leads to an interesting point. Interesting two views here, isn't it? There's the Hannah Arendt view of the strongman Nazi personality, and then there's the Peterson view of our individual moral failings that causes nihilism and that causes the state to become corrupt. So how do we reconcile these two views? I don't know. I don't think David does that in the article, but he does point out some contradictory points between Hannah Arendt's views, where she took a much more critical philosophical lens and viewed what happened in the 20th century, and then Peterson's views that he portrays more in detail in Maps of Meaning. Here's what David writes: this idea of indifference and apathy that Peterson says is what causes totalitarianism, versus, let's say, taking upon responsibility, being the Ubermensch or a savior sometimes, and understanding that we play a role in the birth or the imbuement of totalitarian states or personality or individuals or tyrants. So David writes, sorry, I was very inarticulate in trying to make that point. I'm still learning. Apologies. But David writes, as Hannah Arendt argues in The Origins of Totalitarianism, that word is hard to pronounce. It's kind of a mouthful. Indifference to public affairs and neutrality on political issues are in themselves no sufficient cause for the rise of totalitarian movements. According to Arendt, it is the strong man rather than the indifferent public that has historically led to the rise of totalitarian regimes. As she explains, competitive and hostile attitudes are very useful for those forms of dictatorship in which a strong man takes upon himself the troublesome responsibility for the conduct of public affairs and hardly conforms to traditional or typical definitions of nihilism. This is the point. This is the point. This is an important point because clearly, Peterson talks a lot about taking upon, carrying your own yoke, to put it in Christian parlance, or taking upon the world's burdens onto oneself, and then sort of being a savior. That in contrast to, let's say, apathy or indifference. Now, Arendt says actually no, indifference and apathy isn't the reason that totalitarianism permeates and there's a rise. It's rather this kind of strongman Nietzschean Ubermensch kind of personality. I don't know what to make of it. Firstly, I haven't read this book, even though I listened to David's lectures. So I want to first read the book. Maybe then I'll have a better idea. But it certainly is something to think about, because I certainly, I most definitely can see how that idea of, I think Nietzsche calls it injecting meaning into one's veins, where that idea of being this hyper disciplined, sort of ascetic individual who takes upon responsibility and has order, is hyper conscientious, how that can very easily become a peculiar kind of hubristic, almost narcissistic way to become a strong man and then an eventual tyrant or totalitarian, at least psychologically. I can see how that can manifest in someone in sort of like a psychic state. And I would even say maybe I've even seen that in some people. Maybe even myself, who knows? But Hannah Arendt's point, it should be taken to heart. It's a good point, and David does lay it out well here. And then he gets to an interesting point here on essentialism. So this idea that there are there's an essential nature to being human, which to some extent I still believe. I'm not a complete, in that sense, anti-essentialist. But David writes, Arendt's description of the strong man is founded upon the belief in a kind of human nature which would be subject to the same laws of growth as that of the individual, shares a strong affinity with Peterson's persistent reliance on essentialist positions as illustrated in statements about essential female and masculine pathologies. Arendt elaborates on these essentialist beliefs as irrelevant since Western philosophy and religion has been defining and redefining it for more than 3,000 years. Now, while it's true, this idea of redefining and defining, I would say, and again, this is completely an intuition. I have no, firstly, verbal virtuosity, but also real, let's say, sociological and anthropological evidence to back up this claim. But I do feel intuitively when I look at many cultures and when I even just read about cultures and even experience some cultures, there always seems to be this kind of masculine and feminine. Not and again, it's not a male female thing, because a man could be feminine and masculine both, and the other way around. So it's not really a biological distinction, even though the biological distinction exists. What I'm trying to say is this idea of kind of like an essential feminine and masculine spirit, let's say. It does seem, I don't know if it's fair to say that doesn't exist at all, because one could see it in so many different cultures all across the world. And if something is that common, isn't that maybe pointing towards some kind of deeper truth? Who knows? But again, the more deeper point David's trying to make here is that attitude of essentialism could lead to this totalitarian kind of mindset where you say, this is the way things should be done. This absolutist, almost despotic attitude that this is the way this should be done. So that certainly begs the question, and David doesn't really point this out in the article, but this is exactly what I was thinking while I was reading it, is how do we properly take Peterson's this adopt responsibility or personal responsibility mantra to heart, which I think is a good message, but how do we prevent it from being pathologized as a drive to be a totalitarian? Because, and this is something I realized recently, Enlightenment thinking, we like to think that it was all about freedom and liberty and equality, but no, it certainly had an absolutist attitude towards it. Hobbes, for example. So there were many Enlightenment thinkers who were absolutist, and more importantly, the deeper point is the idea of there being, let's say, categories and this essentialist attitude of Enlightenment thinking that can be certainly connected or even imbue tyrannical, totalitarian sort of thinking. So it's how do we delineate that? And it's very nuanced there. And I really didn't think of this until maybe 1 or 2 years ago. So something to ponder and reflect on. And now we get to the most, in my opinion, the part I like the most and the most interesting part of the article, especially because I'm a Nietzschean, and the more I read Nietzsche, the more I thought, oh, Peterson's, there's something, if people don't read Nietzsche and listen to Peterson lecture on Nietzsche, they'd get a completely different picture on who Nietzsche is. But in any case, I am a Nietzschean, and I really like this part, and I thought David made some good points. So the question is Peterson misappropriating Nietzsche? What I mean by this is, I'm not saying Peterson is misquoting him or quoting him out of context or trying to, intentionally misappropriate him with some kind of underlying motive, unethical underlying motive. Not at all. But sometimes, because like all of us, Peterson's got his own ideology. I'm wondering if what he's really doing is just taking something Nietzsche said and just fitting it into his philosophy, his ideology, and then sharing it with the public. Whereas this isn't what Nietzsche would say. So, as in this synthesis, let's say, of taking what Nietzsche said and synthesizing it along with what Peterson's saying, and whatever that result is, Nietzsche would completely disagree with what that result is. He would be totally opposed to Nietzsche's overall philosophy, even though Nietzsche hasn't really got one set philosophy. And I think he did that intentionally. So one has to be careful. One has to be careful when they try to understand Nietzsche through a Petersonian lens, let's say. David writes, in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche argues that the notion of truth that runs through the course of history, the course of history, are founded not on their objectivity, but in their continual self-proclamation of objectivity. For Nietzsche, the shift from language to science placed the scientific method at the forefront of Western civilization, making everything quantifiable under the scientific gaze. As he explains, it is language which works on building the edifice of concepts. Later, it is science. Nietzsche expands on this idea, writing, what I understand by the spirit of science is the belief which first came to light in the person of Socrates, that the depths of nature can be fathomed, and that knowledge can heal all ills. According to Nietzsche, this belief in the ultimate infallibility of science, or Socrates' tendency to murder art, is destructive, especially when left unacknowledged. Now, Peterson here would certainly agree with this point, because I've listened to a couple of interviews where Peterson comments on Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, and he pretty much says that he's quite disappointed that in Enlightenment Now, Steven Pinker has all these chapters dedicated to the scientific method, enlightenment, freedom, democracy, all that, and a little chapter towards the latter part of the book. I haven't read the book, so I'm not really sure, even though I think I've got a copy, where he dedicates to the arts and the humanities. And he says that that's unfortunate, because really it should be the other way around, because most of life, or most of what we are, is, let's say, we should be indebted to the arts and the humanities. And science is very, very much a new phenomenon. It's a new thing in our society. Therefore, it is a good point. To Nietzsche, science is truly capable of confining the individual within the smallest circle of solvable tasks. As he explains, science, spurred on by its powerful delusion, is hurrying unstoppable to its limits, where the optimism hidden in the essence of logic will founder and break up. So then we get to Nietzsche versus 12 Rules for Life. And this is kind of the point I made when I started commenting on this section, where if Nietzsche read 12 Rules for Life, he'd probably disagree with most of it. And David explains why. 12 Rules for Life, proclaiming the necessity for people, young men. I want to say, David's put this in here kind of as like a sly comment, kind of being dismissive that, oh, Peterson only caters to this certain demographic. It seems like a straw man and a ad hominem attack, because firstly, an ad hominem as if helping young men makes him a particularly evil person. I mean, I don't see what's wrong with helping young men. If people need help, people should get help. I'm a young man, and when I was 20, 21, reading Jordan Peterson's book helped me a lot. It gave me structure and meaning and purpose, and those things matter. Life is difficult, and I'm truly grateful for that. And other than that, Peterson, I know in fact, a lot of the people that I know who are Jordan Peterson fans, let's say, are women. Funny enough, one of my good friends, she and I will be going to the when Jordan Peterson comes to Melbourne, he's visiting Melbourne end of the year, and we bought tickets for his kind of talk, and I'll be going with her, and she loves Jordan Peterson. So I don't know if it's fair that it's sort of like a straw man and an ad hominem, and also frankly such slight comments seem unproductive. I mean, such a good article, and it's just saying young men as if it's a bad thing. It cheapens and reduces this well-written article to that of a hit piece by some corporate media journalists, and that's unfortunate. But anyway, it's just a little bit of criticism that I have. So I'll get back to it. 12 Rules for Life, proclaiming the necessity for people to adopt an ascetic lifestyle in the form of a mutated Christian conservatism, stands diametrically opposed to Nietzsche's central claim in the genealogy of morality, that the ascetic ideal is not something to strive for, but rather it is the consequence of a life attempting to inject artificial meaning into its veins in a poor attempt at inoculation from degeneration. In this capacity, Peterson resembles the ascetic priest that Nietzsche castigates. The task of intellectuals should not be to inject arbitrary rules and regulations into people, but rather to foster perspectival seeing that welcomes more eyes, various eyes, we are able to use to sketch a more complete understanding of our objectivity. Superlative point. In my opinion, this little para here, or this little sentence, let's say, it's the best sentence in the whole article. Really good point, because it's something I began to realize maybe, again, 2 or 3 years ago, because I saw that in our new age entrenched culture, it seems like every public intellectual is becoming a self-help guru. And that's kind of unfortunate, because there's nothing wrong with self-help, but we should understand that everything has its place. Self-help should be separated from intellectualism and public intellectuals, because it seems like, a lot of, even the Sam Harris, he's got meditation and mindfulness. Well, a lot of public intellectuals have just become self-help gurus, kind of the celebrity self-help gurus. And that's unfortunate, because what an intellectual, in my opinion, should do is not reaffirm what you already believe, but yes, as David beautifully puts it and clearly points out, really make us feel uncomfortable in our beliefs, make us completely change our perspectives and view the world in different lenses, and give this kind of perspectival seeing. Adorno had a great quote, I think, in aesthetic theory. I'm completely paraphrasing here, but he says, and he's talking about art here. He says, Adorno, that the real purpose of art should be to sort of, I can't really remember the quote, but the idea is the purpose of art should be to make us feel uncomfortable, to challenge our dogmas, our pre-held beliefs, and really, change our life radically and fundamentally in how we view the world. And in my opinion, that's also what a public intellectual should do, not become a self-help guru. And if they want to become a self-help guru, there's nothing wrong with that. Like that's okay. But then there's something else. They're not a public intellectual or an intellectual for that matter. So this is probably the best point David makes in the whole article. Peterson's project is an attempt then to move away from the Nietzschean notion of perspectival seeing toward the domain of ahistorical, acontextual seeing. This narrowing of possibility operates to maintain the authority of those who choose what is considered what's seen, and through what means pushing society towards sovereign and dictatorial rule. Again, this last bit here is quite apt to the whole COVID lockdown controversy debate that a lot of people got into in the intellectual dark web. I'm using that as an umbrella term for like the Petersons and the Sam Harrises. That's again that idea of perspectival thing is quite important here. So then we get to the section where it's the science versus Peterson, and then David comments on some of the Aristotelian notions of science. He writes, though Peterson's line of argumentation seems to suggest a science postmodernism opposition, a considerable number of scientific journals have published articles addressing the growing stigmatization and discrimination trans and genderqueer people experience regularly. It's a good point. A lot of us don't spend the time to go and read up on these articles, but there certainly is a good amount of literature that properly uses the scientific method to point this out. So it is true, there is that stigmatization within trans people, especially maybe because now it's become a lot more political, and that's quite unfortunate. That is deep. I hate saying that's quite unfortunate because it's like a throwaway term for everything these days. But that's a sad truth, and we should think about that. We should think about that. Such articles, though they conform to the same scientific rationale utilized by Peterson, shed light on the great deal of contradictions, oppositions, and divergent beliefs in this supposedly objective field of study. This is an important point David makes. These studies correspond to the domain of research that aligns with the Aristotelian God, I can't pronounce that, aligns with the Aristotelian maxim of phronesis, which may be understood as fostering practical intellectual activity aimed at clarifying the problems, risks, and possibilities we face as humans and societies. This approach, although still immersed in the scientific tradition, stands opposed to the other domain of Aristotelian reason of episteme that proclaims the a priori nature of scientific knowledge. So this again kind of touches on that. How do we derive oughts plainly from science? Because it seems like the scientific institution itself is, let's say, bifurcated into this phronesis and episteme. And in many ways, phronesis does help us derive oughts. But it is complicated because that also involves contextual seeing, sociology, all of that. This brand of research, while disavowed by Peterson, presents a foray into the lives and experiences of marginalized groups that would otherwise be silenced. Absolutely. And now another interesting point. I would say from the whole article, my favorite parts were Nietzsche and postmodernism and the Baudrillard reality and truth. Well worth a read just due to those two parts. The question that Baudrillard asks is, what is objective truth? Jean Baudrillard has vigorously challenged the position held by scholars such as Peterson on objectivity and truth, suggesting instead that science, like any discourse, is organized on the basis of a conventional logic, adding that it explains things which have been defined and formalized in advance, which subsequently conform to these explanations. And again, Peterson would agree with this point because I've listened to his conversations with recently Richard Dawkins and then Sam Harris, where they get into the fact-value distinction. And again, one would assume that Peterson would find a certain validity in what Baudrillard's pointing out here, because in that sense, Richard Feynman, connecting many figures here. Richard Feynman, probably my favorite scientist. I love listening to his lectures. He is actually wrong to say the philosophy of science is as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds. That's a wrong statement. That's an invalid statement in my opinion, because no, the philosophy of science is a part of the scientific process. It's a part of the scientific institution. In many ways, it maybe is what this Aristotelian phronesis is about. We need to understand what science is and how we make presuppositions. Oh, sorry, on what presuppositions we start from, on what axioms, and that's a good heavens, that probably is the fundamental question of science these days. How do we make our assumptions? What's the starting point? And again, I think apart from the conversations that I've heard Peterson have, he probably understands that this problem inherently exists in our modern conception of science. It's probably why he's interested in Jung, in archetypes, and Christian Neoplatonism, symbolism, and in general religious narrative, because he sees those to be a sort of he sees that can be coupled with science to find some kind of, let's say, objective starting point for science to work off. And I don't know if that's possible, but it certainly at least points to the problem or hints at the problem. So David states Baudrillard doesn't say that scientific conclusions are invalid. He actually doesn't. I think I haven't read much Baudrillard, obviously, but I don't get that impression at least. But what he says very clearly is that whatever these scientific conclusions are, these conclusions should not be transposed onto any societal or cultural context. So these studies, so there were some studies that he cited above in the article. The studies speak to the late Baudrillard's conception of singularity. Okay, I'm gonna say this is a part that I kind of am struggling to grok yet. I still can't fathom it. I don't know. For me, it still seems incomprehensible. But I think it's because I haven't done enough reading. I haven't done enough study into Baudrillard. So David writes. Baudrillard's conception of singularity, which holds that every detail of the world is perfect if it is not referred to some larger set. Reality for Baudrillard is always caught in a play of signification, and suggestions of a naturality made by the authoritative scientific community mistake the only true nature of the world as a world of appearances in which there may not be anything but a discourse of the real and the rational. Just a point here, the idea of, I think this in many ways is the scientific question, the philosophical question and the philosophical battle that we've been having since time immemorial, ever since, Socrates, Plato, and all that, is in our epistemology, how do we know what's true and how do we know what's appearing as true? It seems to be the distinction between, let's say, the rationalists and the empiricists, between the John Locke and the David Hume, or the continental philosophers, and then the kind of the English analytical philosophers. How do we know what's true and what appears as true? So that's such an important point, and Baudrillard in many ways, Baudrillard's working off that here. According to Baudrillard, then notions of an objective truth are fundamentally flawed, and any attempt to occupy an objective field of study is bound to fail and merely become science signifiers of a real signified. I hope he's up doing a bit of a wordplay there. That's difficult to understand. The fundamental impossibility of performing objective studies and or revealing fundamental truths is understood by Baudrillard and his theory of simulation. For Baudrillard, simulation occurs when the world has become real beyond our wildest expectations and can be described as the outcome of calculated move to put the illusion of the world to death. Scientific discourse that rely on notions of objectivity and truth, therefore dissolve into the imaginary of the sign or the sphere of truth, and leaves us with reality and therefore simulation in all its glory. The real then is merely a particular case of that simulation that Baudrillard argues allows our society to think itself and live itself as superior to all others. Baudrillard's work can be read as not necessarily opposing the domain of scientific inquiry, but accounting for the degree to which any scientific inquiry should be attuned to the cultural and significator conditions of the object of study. So now here's where, again, I completely attribute this to my lack of understanding, my lack of knowledge. The reason I'm saying that is not for some kind of false modesty or false humility. It's because genuinely I haven't done enough study and reading. This isn't my field of study. I haven't gone through the proper formal academic process of studying all these philosophers. I'm a autodidact. I'm doing it on my own. But really, sometimes when I read these kind of paras, I do wonder, is this some kind of word game that these thinkers are playing with their brilliant verbal and intellectual capabilities, with their ability to write? And is it some kind of game? I don't even mean game in a cynical way. I mean, is it truly a way they're trying to make some pre-held belief they have and try to make it look as if something that's true about the world and make it cohere using language? Is it a language game, to sound Wittgensteinian? I don't know, because again, when I read this, even though, as I said before, I don't fully comprehend it or fully understand it, I certainly can see that it's intimations of something true, something that's palpably true about reality. And it points to so many different domains of our current way of viewing the world. And for me, that coheres, even though what they're trying to say really doesn't cohere, if that makes sense. Like, what I'm trying to say is sort of, let's say normatively, some of what they're saying is like, oh yeah, that I can see how they come to these conclusions. Okay, I don't know, just thinking out loud here, as I tend to do in this podcast. On the topic of not understanding things, I would say, again, not David's fault, my own ignorance. I truly found it hard to understand this section, Baudrillard, Butler, and those voices of the marginalized. So that's about the whole essay. That's about 3 or 4 paras. And here's the thing. I think part of it was because simply it's that section of the essay about the gender controversy that I didn't really care that much, to be frank. And I think I just truly couldn't penetrate it. That's what it was. It was, the reason I found it a bit incomprehensible was because I could see that David's making some important points here, but I didn't know why. But like, for example, the previous points, even though there were parts of it that I didn't really get, I at least got the essence of his argument. I was getting at where he was going towards. But this section for me, I couldn't penetrate it, and it didn't click with me, to put it plainly. And apart from that, this is just a complete personal thing. I've recently been trying to study Heidegger, been trying to get through Being and Time. Mate, I am eternally perplexed about everything. I haven't really, if you can probably see from this podcast, I haven't got anything substantial or coherent to say, but especially phenomenology, but virtually anything, because Heidegger has completely overturned my views on so many things. Yeah, I'm in this place of this deep. I'm being extremely self-critical of what I believe, and I'm also very uncertain about virtually all my beliefs. And that on that rather lugubrious note, let's go to the conclusion. But before I do read the conclusion, I want to say something. Firstly, I want to say I think Peterson totally deeply understands everything that David points out here, even though he isn't very explicit about it. He does get he sees this inherent incommensurability between what we have as modern science and how can we derive values from it. He sees the incommensurability between what modernity tells us and the deeper truth that postmodernists found, this idea of context. He's even said it in a couple of his podcasts that he disagrees with this notion of the complexity of interpretations and how deep that really goes into reality in some sense, not just at, let's say, at the level of text or hermeneutics, but that this the problem of interpretation is a big problem. And he points to AI researchers, he points to many places within the field of science to hint at that. So I think he gets it. And I would say it's because of that maybe that I say that apart from him as a person, but just as an intellectual, I've begun to admire him a lot more because he's willing to publicly flesh out these ideas and make mistakes publicly, especially someone like him who's got such public acclaim and because he gets himself in all these political controversies. The moment he makes a mistake, he is hammered and there all these scathing critiques written about him, which can be quite difficult being a public figure. One shouldn't just think that it's quite hard to go through that. It's a lot of stress. So I do admire that kind of courage that he has to publicly deal with these issues. And I've got to say, I am a bit disheartened that I feel like with time, with his influence, he's becoming more and more ideological and even a bit more dogmatic in his beliefs and his views, which for me is unfortunate because then this project he has to work this out to try and reconcile these, if it's reconcilable, these incommensurabilities. I feel like that then he won't have a genuine journey or in doing that, because if he becomes more and more, let's say, dogmatic in his views, I really hope he doesn't go there. But again, all the points David makes in this article, I think, is very apt to who Jordan Peterson is, and I think he gets it. Secondly, I want to say, David, if you do watch this episode, I really hope you do. I'm gonna try and tweeting this at you a couple of times to try and get your attention. But if you do watch this episode and if you come this far, mate, I know I'm very, very long-winded. It's a problem of mine. I never get to the point. But if you come this far, I would like to sincerely invite you on the podcast for an interview, because I would love to talk to you and learn from you. I have so many questions. I gotta say, David, again, not blowing steam up your ass, to put it in a vulgar way. You truly have been that kind of intellectual that you talk about this part here about perspectival seeing. You probably are seeing right now me learning from you and trying to see the world and see all these topics through different perspectives and different views, because you fostered that kind of perspectival seeing in me. So, and I'm a product of, in that sense, of your YouTube channel, a living example, let's say, to put it in a dramatic way. And again, your work on Hannah Arendt has made me fall in love with her in some sense. Maybe, in fact, maybe I should have you on the podcast, if you do agree, that is, of course, after I'm done reading The Origins of Totalitarianism, because then I'll have something a bit more substantial to discuss with you. But again, this is my invite to the podcast. And on that note, I would read the conclusion to the article and end this episode. Beyond locating the various contradictions and fallacious remarks Peterson makes, this paper has also argued that Peterson's assault against Bill C-16 risks mirroring the same systemic instantiations of totalitarianism that he claims to know so much about. To reiterate, this is not to suggest that he represents these movements directly, but that There are many affinities between these oppressive ideological systems and Peterson's faith in a universal conception of truth. Astute point. This paper serves the purpose of mounting a philosophically analytical rebuttal to Peterson's central claims by pointing to the many shortcomings of his speculations and locating epistemic fallacies that may be observed in his ideas. This is a necessary form of critique because, unlike the Hegelian model of oppositional politics that poses a critique from an antithetical and exterior positionality, this form identifies the core of the theoretical inadequacy of Peterson's project from the inside. And I think, David, you've accomplished that.